and welcome all of you to this lecture. I don't know whether it's a lecture or a speech. We'll find out. This is the first in a series of lectures sponsored by the Asian Studies program here at CASE, and it's entitled China at 60, Myths and Realities. It behooves you to attend all of these because we begin to probe the reality that is China today. The lectures by Professor Tan and Goldstein, as well as Dr. Wilner, probe specific aspects of Chinese society, the Chinese reality. What I hope to do today is to provide an overview of this, on the Chinese situation, as we begin the second decade of what some are calling the century of China. How fragile is China is a question, the title of this talk. My talk will carry that question throughout, so I have no answers. If you're looking here for the answer, there's more food out there and you can leave if you like. By the way, this title, How Fragile is China, is also the title of a political science departmental seminar that is going on this term. And the reading load there, the students, some of whom are here, might say, well, that's a little high, a lot of reading. But so there's more to this topic than just what I am going to present today. I've toyed with other titles for this talk. And so I like to use the Chinese love of numbers, and we come up with the 3 benefits and the 6 woes. So the math there might give you a little hint as to where I'm headed. Now, before we get into the meat of what's China, it's good for people, especially in an academic setting, to understand where we have come from in terms of studying China. In years past, China studies boiled down to a rather simple guideline. What is the Communist Party up to? And this went on from 1949 through 1978. That was a guideline, and so scholars looked at the control of wealth, the control of power, the control of society, the control of people, individuals and as a group. With access to China during this time greatly limited, scholars began to create other ways of finding out, and so we had institutionalized refugee interviews, largely held in Hong Kong, but also elsewhere. And this was the bulk of our information during that time. In the past 30 years, which is the reform era, we've studied the political economy of China. So here we have some new guidelines, and that largely goes from 1979 to the present. How far will China go in its reforms? How far should it go? And when should it do it? And what reform is needed next? These are the questions scholars focused on. There's a whole bunch of other questions that PowerPoint doesn't allow you to put them all on so you could see them. What are the reforms? How do they work? How are they implemented? How are they accepted by the party? What are their implications for China? What are their implications for doing business in China? What are their implications for international relations? By any measure, China's economic development, economic growth in the past 30 years has been a great success. And this brings us to the 3 myths. The first is the country is rich. When we lived there between 1984 and 1988, it was quite poor. An emphasis of that is the crammed buses, because there weren't enough buses. People would jump on the buses, and you never had to hold on to anything. You just stood there because there was no way to fall. I remember in Shanghai, our daughter, who was about 8 at the time, was in the crowd with us, and she got on the bus, and off it went. And where's she going to end up? Happily, she knew to get off 4 stops down the road. The second benefit is more Chinese are better off today. Chinese friends who could not buy dinner when we lived there do so now with credit cards. And rather than take a bus, they pick us up in their car. And then we have drinks after dinner at their condominiums, which are quite nice, or their penthouses. The third benefit is that the Chinese Communist Party gets to take credit for this. Now, I don't have any specific examples of that because we've all heard the story, heard the line, under the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, blah, blah, blah. So I don't need to go into that. So what's the current situation? The current guideline is, quite simply, China has become a very complex society. Everything that had been hidden, I dare say it was always complex, but it had been hidden. Everything that had been hidden is now in the open. And the guideline is simply the old Chinese saying, it's, you can't ride a tiger and get off. The Communist Party is riding a tiger that is too dangerous to dismount today. Everything the party does to maintain control over one aspect of society impacts another aspect of that society. That itself requires new policies, which of course impacts the next aspect of society. The tiger is not running in a straight line. It's running in a circle, and the party doesn't know where or when or how to get off. So let's look at some of the reality today. The Americans' impression of China is not good. China steals our jobs. China holds our debt. The 21st century is being called the century of China, and it may well become the next superpower. For many Americans, this is a world of hurt. Plain Dealer reporter, columnist Tom Sudas wrote Sunday that Americans have three minimum daily requirements: a foreign enemy, a crisis, and a disease of the month. I dare say that with China, it fits. Well, we blame China for the job crisis, so there's the foreign enemy and the crisis, and we don't even remember SARS or the avian flu because everything has been taken over by H1N1. Blaming China, I submit, is partly misplaced. We are also to blame. That's a subject for another lecture series that maybe the Asian Studies program can pick up or the American Studies program can do. Now, let's look at the reality, some of the reality here, just quickly. China's growth. Most of the figures you will see are from the Economist Intelligence Unit or the Congressional Research Service. China's economy today is 14 times larger than it was in 1979. And real per capita GDP is 10 times larger than 1979. China has had an average growth rate per year over the last 30 years of 9.9%. Compare that with our paltry, I think it's 3.04% between 1979 and 2006. Okay. In 2007, the growth rate was 13%. In 2008, it was 9.6%. 2009, in the midst of this recession, is still expected to be 8%. Now, some Chinese think that's a hard landing. I don't think so. So let's look at trade. Trade with the United States, $5 billion in 1980. Today, it's total trade, $387 billion. Well, in 2007. 2008, Chinese surplus, our deficit, was $366.332 billion. In 1985, that deficit was just $6 million. China has become the factory of the world. Everything is made there. Now, 60%, about 60% of our trade deficit with China is not goods made by Chinese companies, but made by American companies that export back to the United States. The large trade surplus, foreign direct investment, and large purchases of foreign currency by the Chinese government have made China the world's largest holder of foreign exchange reserves at 2.3 trillion, that's T, at the end of 2008. China is also the largest holder of American Treasury notes. China is our banker, and it's not nice to be angry at your banker. The figures are there. November 2009, $789.6 billion, $800 billion almost a trillion, up from 713 in a year before. In December of 2007, it was only 406 billion. Now, I don't know if you recall what was going on in 2008. We still had George Bush was still president, and he was asking the Chinese to buy more bonds, in part to pay for how we live. This means the U.S. is borrowing Chinese money to buy Chinese goods. What does that tell you about our economy? Indeed, what does that tell you about the Chinese economy? Something is amiss. Something may go awry. Let's continue. In 2000, China started to go global. Overseas investment strategy. In 2007, it launched the China Investment Corporation, which is directly under the State Council. It's an arm of the government, and it oversees $200 billion of China's $2 trillion, 2.6 or 2.3, whatever that was, holdings of U.S. dollars. Now, the company is run by a man by the name of Gao Shiqing. In an article titled, "Be Nice to Your Banker," or to countries that lend you money, James Fallows described him. Gao would fit no American pre-existing idea of a communist Chinese official. He speaks accented but fully colloquial and very high-speed English. He has a law degree from Duke, which he earned in the 1980s after working as a lawyer and a professor in China. And he was an associate in Richard Nixon's Wall Street law firm. I forget the name of that. His father was a Red Army officer who was on the Long March with Mao. As a teenager during the Cultural Revolution, Gao worked on a railroad building gang and in an ammunition factory. This man is in charge of investing $200 billion overseas. We are starting to see Chinese brands here. Haier, which makes stoves, refrigerators, etc. Haier is the company that wanted to buy Maytag, but they backed out at the last minute. Congressional research cites Chinese data saying its annual overseas direct investment rose from $2.9 billion in 2003 to $55.9 billion. So we're beginning to see things like Lenovo. They bought the personal computer division of IBM. Next year, they will begin exporting to the United States an automobile called the Cheery. I don't know about that name selling too well here, but we'll all be cheered. On January 8th of this year, Reuters, that's just 2 weeks ago, Reuters reported that China sold more than 13.5 million vehicles in 2009, overtaking the U.S. to become the world's largest auto market. The final figure compared with annual sales of 10.4 million cars and light trucks sold in the United States. 2009 was the lowest level in 27 years here in this country. So where's the myth? Well, we might quibble with these numbers and quibble with what they mean. This paints a reality of China's economic growth. With this much growth going on for 30 years, we get the impression that this will only continue. That, I believe, is the myth. This will not continue. Susan Shirk, a professor at University of California, San Diego, and who was on the Clinton National Security Council, said China's leaders are, quote, haunted by the fear that their days in power are numbered. Why? China today is growing a civil culture. It is reacting to public pressure rather than leading the public to what they might consider to be greener pastures. And there is an evident growth of contentious politics, which I'll explain here. Before our very eyes, China has become a very complex society. It is much more than what the Communist Party does or says. The reality that is China now is this: an independent source of wealth, separate from the party. A new, rather impatient generation of entrepreneurs and political activists. New organizations, these might be called NGOs, non-governmental organizations, that push the government to change policy. Numerous informal associations, gathering places such as pubs and tea houses, internet cafes, and so forth. This has exploded. If you went to China today and you saw these, you might think they were always there, but I can tell you in the mid-'80s, you didn't find them. An increasing exposure to international organizations and political systems. So, each of these is pushing this civic culture, or civil society, however you want to term it. In time, this culture will challenge China's one-party state, or change it. We don't often see the contention that goes on, although that's becoming more obvious. But China is facing a changing nature of contentious politics. China typically is a cellular society. What goes on in one village, few people had heard about it. That's why you have dialects all over the country. But that cellular nature is giving way to wider aggregation of contention. Word of protests in one locality, however small, easily spreads to others which may have the same complaint. The internet is the obvious source here, but so is texting, so are cell phones. The Chinese were texting long before we started doing that here. They were doing it 10 years ago. We started about, 4 or 5 years ago? Chinese are also asking whether economic development is the cause of hardship for a growing number within the society. This emphasizes this growing gap between rich and poor. And Chinese are looking carefully at the policy outcomes of their protests. What has the party done? What will it do? What does it say it will do? What are the outcomes? So, all of this going on leads to debates. The debates that go on within China. They pose several questions that the Communist Party never had to face before. When the debate within China is about how best to democratize the country, and not about Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought. When the debate is about how best to govern, and not about how best to control, although the party is always looking for ways to govern and maintain control. When the debate is about how best to open the party and not keep it closed, and when the debate is about the best means to handle public protest and not better means of coercion, something is afoot. And when top leaders, Hu Jintao, Wan Jiabao, when top leaders claim democracy is needed to guarantee continued economic growth and success, then that's something that is afoot we might call bureaucratic, legal, and political reform. China's leaders face an array of problems that, if not addressed, will make it unlikely to continue the economic growth that we have witnessed over the last 30 years. And with political reform quickly becoming the topic of the day, in China, the party faces challenges to its legitimacy not seen since the 20s and 30s. Put bluntly, the People's Republic of China, I believe, is fragile. The party's ability to continue as the sole power holder is not inevitable, and that poses problems that it could affect all of us, not just Chinese. Now note, I said fragile. How the party handles its challenges will shape what happens in the coming years. This leads us to the 6 woes. I put these in categories because the woes that China faces, the challenges that China faces, are too numerous to elaborate within an hour. So I put these into 6 categories of woes. But here they are: economic, political, social, cultural, coercive, or the lack thereof, or the inability thereof, and international. These categories are not mutually exclusive. Each affects all the others. They all fall back on each other and weave the complexity that I'm talking about. By themselves, they may not be enough to prompt regime change. Taken together, however, they do add up. So let's look at some of these. Economic. Economic reforms are incomplete. Here, they have not addressed the reforms in monetary and fiscal policy, the mechanisms thereof, the banking system, and Social Security, to mention just a few. And this lack of complete reform, in part prompts rent-seeking activity by authorities at the local, provincial, and central levels. Rent-seeking activity. Another way, that's an academic way of saying corruption. So, how does this happen when you have incomplete controls? Here's a picture of Wuhan, China. This is the Han River, and this is the Yangtze River. And this little thumb of land along the whole stretch of the Han, which goes up here, is prime real estate. In 2004, Wuhan City Fathers held a contest. Who has an idea to develop this thumb of land so it has best use and that we can afford and that serves the people? Renmin Fu Wu, my friend, has a t-shirt back there. We put in for that. At that time, I was running a trading company, and my colleague is an architect who was a partner with Buckminster Fuller, and we put in this, a geodesic dome on that thumb of land. And we met with every city organization that could possibly have a hand or a say in this, including members, vice chairman of the Wuhan City Communist Party. This would have been the largest dome in the world, 120 meters high. Inside would have been condominiums, apartments, hotels, plural, shopping centers, restaurants, entertainment centers, all of that. And we spent about 6 months trying to sell this to the city of Wuhan. They all loved it, but they were unable to make a decision because they could not find the appropriate financing to do this. They could not find the appropriate developers to handle the shopping centers and all of that goes into building something like this. The shell itself would have cost $25 million. That's not a lot of money, but they could not come up with it. Now, what they've done here, all along here, was supposed to be something that resembled University Circle. Museums, entertainment, the whole shebang. There's nothing there. All that's there is a public park. It took them, this was taken in 2007, it took them 4 years to just redo the landscape and put in a park. They're still waiting to do something, but they can't agree. It's sort of like the medical mart here. Nobody can seem to agree. So that's part of the problem with economic development reforms not proceeding. There's no money for this. For something that's entertainment. There is money. If we had suggested let's build a new steel mill, there would have been money for that. But there's no money for this. The third, if I get back there, is an impatience of a new, younger generation, many of whom were educated abroad. We met in that effort to sell that dome. We met with the head of the Wuhan Land Use Planning Department, which is different than the planning department, but land use planning. This fellow was educated in France. He spoke fluent French, fluent German, and a little bit of English. His attitude was one of frustration, near disgust with the way the city made decisions. And he told us so openly. Third, there is an obvious need for a new development model. China has used, much like Taiwan did in Japan early on, an export-led development model. In 2008-09 recession, put thousands of workers out of business, out of jobs, and closed hundreds of factories that were all geared toward making products that go to Walmarts of the world, the Kmarts. Last November, European Chamber of Commerce took a close look at this, chamber in China, and found that China's industrial overcapacity, they have an overcapacity of industrial goods, is caused by three things. First, rapid urbanization. They estimate 1% of population per year creates demand, moving from rural countryside to the cities, creates demand for new housing, which creates demand for construction materials. Second, a high savings rate caused by a lack of Social Security, limited investment choices in households, stringent capital controls, and policies that transfer income from households to producers. And third, low input prices aimed at stimulating heavy industry. China cannot grow the consumption model that it needs. It can't grow consumption in line with GDP growth because it continues to transfer wealth from households to producers. All this forces the party to consider fundamental policy choices that include capital markets. We don't want to do that. Banking, that's too hard to do. And currency controls. Why doesn't China float its currency? It's a rhetorical question, but we might get at it later on. It's because the value of the currency is set at so many dollars. If you float it, it's not going to be worth $6.8. It's going to be worth only $5. There are going to be people in China who will lose a lot of money. So, how do they meet these challenges? I can tell you stories about this. Mandatory retirement age for many government workers in China is 55. I can't tell you how many of these people came to me wanting a job with our trading company. We need to make some money. We don't have health insurance. We don't have retirement. I can work for you. I've got these products. I know all the buyers, all the sellers. There is a lack of health insurance, which I'll get to in a moment. There is a cost for education, even primary education. People are saving their money and not spending it. China has the highest savings rate in the world and the lowest consumption spending. We are the exact opposite. I used to tell people, if they had a question in China and they didn't want to hire our services to help them, that, okay, here's what you do. When you get there and you confront a situation, think of what you would do in the United States and do the opposite. 90% of the time, that was correct. The other 10%, you should have hired me. Another economic problem is the global economy. An export-led model makes it difficult to follow the rules of the game, institute international quality standards, and provide greater access to the domestic market. China follows, as Paul Krugman wrote earlier this month, a mercantilist policy. This happens all the time. They don't want you to come in. Our trading companies spend a lot of time buying and selling special and rare gases. It's immaterial what those are. They are used to make computer chips and semiconductors. They cut the silicon wafers, etc. China has those gases, all of them. There's about 38 gases that are at 99.9%. But to do this properly, you need gases at 99.9999%. You can find those in the United States. So we went around to all of these semiconductor people in China and said, we can supply your gas, the gases that you need. And they said, we know you can. We know that you have high-quality gases, but we'd rather buy from a Chinese company. So most American gas companies would walk away from that, but we put our heads together and said, let's create a Chinese gas company. It was quite easy to do. We found a Chinese gas company and incorporated them into our little network. So things can happen. China is also faced with broad commodity speculation. Right now there's a housing bubble. And they have mortgages. You could buy a house and get a mortgage. And you can buy a house in China without putting a whole lot of money down. But that mortgage is going to come due. What happens when the bubble breaks? We know what happens. So right now they have said to slow down the flipping of houses, selling one, buying it, and then selling it again. They have reinstituted the sales tax. You have to hold that house for 5 years to prevent this kind of mass speculation. Okay, those are economic woes. Political. China has a low capacity to transit from control of society to governance. A society's ability to tolerate a lack of governance is in direct proportion to a viable alternative. There is no alternative in China. The government finds it increasingly difficult to address critical issues important to the public's health, safety, and general welfare. 2 examples. Healthcare. The UN estimates 300 million people lack health insurance, while the others in China must pay an ever-increasing premium. Sound familiar, doesn't it? People rather save against that rainy day than spend their money. The second is product quality standards, and there are many more. I'm just picking on a couple. Melamine in milk powder killed 4 children and sickened 53,000 others. We had lead paint in the toys that came here. But with laws and regulations unenforced at the local level, Chinese firms cut corners in order to maximize profits. So unsafe food and consumer products end up here as well as in China. Second is a decline of institutional legitimacy that goes along with this. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. This is created by an inability to address very real public needs, but it also comes from the demise of Communist China's ideology. Communist China is said to resemble a church without a religion. I think that's true. After the fall of the Soviet Communist Party and those in Eastern Europe, the Chinese party spent 15 years studying the mistakes those European parties made and has tried to adapt to changing social and political conditions. This has led to an opening of the party, including primary elections for local party posts. Unheard of. That's more open than some of our political parties here. And admittance of capitalists into the party. The third is corruption. A declining legitimacy leads to this rent-seeking activity I talked about. And if you have government control decentralized, from the center to the provinces to the cities to the localities, you also have decentralized corruption. In short, it's everywhere in the country. Which brings us to the lack of rule of law and an independent judiciary. Judges and courts are appointed by local government officials. Local government officials may be the government, but standing behind them is the party apparatus at that locality. There is no independence to enforce the laws on the books. China has laws on the books, but so consequently, what do you get? An increasing number of public protests over a variety of issues. Official reports of demonstrations, some of which are violent, rose from 8,700 in 1993 to 87,000 in 2005, and that number, approximately, continues to this day. This does not include Tibet, nor Xinjiang, the subject of Professor Goldstein's lecture in a few weeks. Protests are over pollution, public health, government corruption, local government land seizures. Somebody was talking to me about, there's an article in the New York Times today, I forget who mentioned that to me, about a woman who burned herself, killed herself by burning herself because the local government bulldozed her house down. It also are over peasants not seeing the benefits of all this rapid economic growth. They see all this on TV, how great China's doing, all the advertising to buy an Armani suit, and yet they can't get to that. Protests are over unemployment and a perception that those with connections, guanxi in Chinese, reap the benefits of China's economic growth. Consider this. A 2005 UN report concluded that the income gap between urban and rural residents was among the highest in the world, and that this threatens social stability. That's the UN words. 6, Chinese are also getting better at a variety of contentious strategies. I mentioned this before, including internet-based coordination, legal challenges in court, and the growth of NGOs. The specter of a national protest by discontented groups is the party's worst fear. I'll get back to that in a moment. This is what prompts repeated calls by Chinese officials for social stability so we can continue to grow. Social stability. It's their mantra. 7 is erosion of party control. The party has given up the hukou system, which used to keep people in place through a job. They give you a job, they give you a house, they give you your school, they give you your stores, they give you your health care. It's all gone. People are free to go where they want to go. And the party is challenged to keep a lid on electronic communications. Consider the recent ongoing case with Google. I saw a TV interview of young Chinese people in the university district up in Beijing, and they were all complaining, how am I going to live without Google? Some of us might remember that, but still, if you become accustomed to it, if you become accustomed to a free flow of information, it can be drastic. And the way the Chinese have handled the Google situation shows a great ineffectiveness of the party to force their will, other than through clumsy activity. Another political element is succession issue in 2012. that's when we'll get new leaders, a new president and a new premier, and probably a new general secretary of the party. Who's that going to be? Nobody seems to know yet. Oh, we can argue about this group and that group, but nobody seems to know. And finally, there's this ongoing debate over democracy. In 2006, there was an article called "Democracy is a Good Thing" that was widely read in China. It was written by Yu Keping, Deputy Director of the Compilation and Translation Bureau of the Chinese Communist Party. It came within the party. Even top party leaders, as I mentioned, are calling for democracy, though these have not been defined what they mean by democracy. In 2007, President Hu Jintao and Premier Wen Jiabao pledged to push political reform. Hu said that if there is no democracy, there will be no modernization. Wen called for a broader democratic political participation for both the public and the political establishment. Quoting Yu Keping, "Democracy is a good thing. This is true not only for individuals or certain officials, but also for the entire nation and for all the people of China." Heady stuff. Mao is turning over in his mausoleum. Social. I'll go through these. It's pretty self-evident. The rise of the civil society that I mentioned, a declining dependence on the party, environmental degradation impacting the quality of life and public health. 20 of the 30 world's most polluted cities are in China. There are cancer villages where people drink this chemically tainted water. These are rivers that are dead. They can no longer be brought back to life simply by stopping pollution. Increased diseases such as emphysema, and compounding this is a water shortage in the north. The Gobi Desert is really only about 60 to 80 miles away from Beijing. China's National Environmental Protection Agency estimates the cost of pollution of all kinds at $226 billion, or 10% of the country's GDP. Each year. China instituted an inclusion in their GDP calculations of that cost once, for 1 year. And then they stopped because it's bad publicity, basically. And then you have, finally, new interests other than politics. The basis of Chinese Communist Party control is involvement of the public in politics, as defined by the party, of course. But people don't care anymore. People want to talk about automobiles. They want to talk about vacations. They want to talk about electronics, computer technology, all that kind of stuff. Art, literature, movies, theater. They're into that rather than politics. Sounds familiar, too. This means that the party, a key component of its ideology, is even being further stripped away. Well, then we have cultural issues, globalization of information, the rise of capitalism and the fall of socialism. In 1988, I came back from my job as trade rep for the state of Ohio and told a group of people assembled by the Development Department in Columbus that there are no longer any communists in China. Joining the Communist Party is like joining the Kiwanis Club. I got more laughs here today than I did then. I got stone silence. Nobody believed it. Today, it's true. It's hard to find a rock bed, dyed-in-the-wool communist. And then there is a changing identity. Many Chinese, while they may be nationalists, also see themselves as more cosmopolitan. They are in touch with the wide, wide world. And that gets us to coercion. The party's control, ability to coerce people, while still there, is diminishing. There's a rising professionalism in the military, which is a subject for another whole area, which maybe Dr. Wilner will get into a little bit. Many Chinese see themselves as not interested in the military. And then you have the rise of independent computer hackers. These are the people who might hack into Google, but they're also the people who knocked down the government's great firewall of China, the blocking of the internet. This is a battle that's going on below the surface between the hackers who want to open this censorship of the internet in China and the government that wants to increase the censorship. It goes back and forth. Finally, international. Increasing awareness of foreign political systems and increasing awareness of foreign legal systems and independent judiciaries. Ongoing influence and power of the United States. We might sit here and say, what? Ongoing influence and power of the U.S.? It's there. They believe it. An embarrassment by others speaking, I'm sorry, I typed that wrong, speaking of China's shortcomings. They don't like it when Hillary Clinton blasts them for not having an open internet. Ergo today, the party lashed out at the United States for speaking out of turn. So, all this leads us to the future. Yogi Berra said it's hard to make predictions, especially about the future, but I'll give it a shot. With all these issues that I've talked about, Chinese intellectuals debating democracy, top Chinese leaders saying democracy in some form is needed to continue economic success, with incomplete economic reforms, with political reform rising to the top of China's agenda, and increasing involvement of China and Chinese in international systems, organizations, and on a one-to-one individual level, we have to consider what might happen. This is important because it not only impacts the Chinese, but U.S. China relations, and indeed Chinese relations in the world. So let's put all this into some historical context. Big events don't simmer in China. They explode. In 1989, the student movement, the student democracy movement, where'd they come from? They were just, before Hu Yaobang died and they had this public funeral in Tiananmen, they were just going to class. Where'd they come from? Thousands of them. Deng sent in the army. He had the prestige and the authority to do that, but know this, 8 military commanders protested that, and some refused to participate. Does Hu Jintao have this same prestige and authority should another uprising occur? 1999, Falun Gong. All of a sudden, in the front gate of the Chinese government, there were 10,000 people. All overnight. No one knew they were coming, but there they were, suddenly. And in 2003, we had the SARS scare, which took Chinese government totally by surprise. No one saw it coming. And it shut, I was there in China at the time, and I can tell you it shut China down. People were begging for masks, and I had boxes of them. That's another story. Another historical context is China's dynastic cycle. Here it is, you can see it. Every dynasty goes through these steps. Where is China today? I show this to my classes on China, and I say, where do you think China is today? And they all say, well, it's somewhere around 8. I think it's around 9, myself. I think it's very unstable, certainly fragile. It's weak. China is a weak country. So, the new dynasty, this dynastic cycle is part and parcel of China's political culture. It will not change unless they move to political pluralism and a legitimate means of giving up power from one party to another. Taiwan has done that. That's one reason why the mainland refuses to give up the use of force against Taiwan, because they fear political pluralism. That might mean a loss of power. So, what are the possibilities for the future? Here they are. Muddling through. Most likely this will occur in the short term. This continues the status quo, but an increasingly ineffective central government over key issues involving social welfare policies, corruption, employment, and the environment present the public with little choice. Muddling through cannot last forever. The second is rise of political pluralism. Emboldened by an ineffective Communist Party at the central level, opposition parties would organize to offer alternative policies for governing China. Opposition parties? They're there. Here they are. These are registered and allowed. The revolutionary Kuomintang, that's left over the leftists of the KMT that didn't flee to Taiwan. The China Democratic League, China, you can see them there. All of these, 8, I believe there's 8 there, political parties with a lot of people in them. And then there are these. These are suppressed. These are political parties too. And they're all relatively new within the last, well, the China Democracy Party started with Democracy Wall in 1978. The others are all within the last 10 years or so. So, rising political pluralism. These parties may be part of that. How are they going to form? How are they going to ally? Who knows? The political scene, if something happens that allows them, that makes them legal, like the Democratic People's Party in Taiwan was finally legalized in 1991. It had existed for 15 or 20 years prior to that, would give us a political scene that would be quite chaotic, but progressing toward a nationalist consolidation of parties into a manageable few. It's conceivable that the Nationalist Party on Taiwan would ally with its counterparts in the mainland, albeit only to wrest power from the communists and not necessarily a long-term marriage. Whatever political pluralism arises, the system would be decidedly non-Western. Well, what about a military dictatorship? If there is an inability of the party to agree on appropriate political leadership or increasing division over policy choices, and the military stays unified, this would lead to an outright takeover of the country by the military. And China would begin to look very much like Taiwan prior to the lifting of martial law in 1987 and legalization of opposition parties in 1991. It would require a unified military position on political issues, which doesn't exist. So that leads us to the fourth, collapse and chaos. If the military is divided, accompanied by an increasingly ineffective and divided Communist Party, China's government would collapse, could give rise to regional governments, which is historically China's fallback position. Warring States period. Chaos might follow. Different segments of the army favoring one type of government or another could enter into armed fighting, with a full-scale civil war possible. There were units of the Chinese military shooting at one another during the Cultural Revolution, so this is not that far-fetched. The country would once again be governed by warlords. So you're all wondering what I think of these three. Which one will occur? The optimist, in Chinese scholarship there are two camps, the optimists and the pessimists, and then there's a few people in the middle. The optimist in me sees China muddling through with a long period of experimenting with democracy and political pluralism. It'll take a long time. But I do have my pessimistic days, so who can tell? I do not see the military as a unified group. With political reform now on the agenda, something, sometime, soon, has to give. I don't know the answer, but I think that's where we'll see. Now, what I can tell you is that China will become a major factor in international relations in the coming decade or two and beyond. I get the sense that America tends to ignore China. It's there. We should keep our eye on them, but we're otherwise occupied. This speaks to the need, and this I can predict. There is a growing need for more China specialists in political science, cross-cultural communications, economics, sociology, anthropology, psychology, and history, and anything else. So all of you students there, you have a bright future ahead of you, if you're so inclined. So, with that, I'll close, and I'll take any questions you may have. And we have a young man in an orange shirt. He's a big Browns fan who hails from Connecticut, who will pass around a microphone. And I'll try to answer your questions as best I can. Thank you. Thank you.
One thing that surprises me is that you didn't say anything about the one-child policy, which gives China, I think, a very different demographic and dynamic of attitudes towards people, especially young people, than other civilizations. And another piece of that is the second part of that, or a second question maybe is, I always wonder why China has been so, or Asians in general, I guess, have been so willing to embrace so many aspects of Western culture, such as classical music, for example. What is it about that culture, whereas it's rejected? It seems like our culture is rejected by in the Middle East, for a lot of the Middle East, for example, but not in a place like China. What is it that's different about it?
You had two questions here.
That's two questions.
The first is the demographics. I guess I can't hold that too close. The demographic issue is something that I did not address. An oversight on my part. It's certainly part of this new generation where they're just one child in the family. These people are aggressive. They do wear the real Armani suits, and those who are not as successful wear the knockoffs. I just neglected to address that. The other one is about the culture and why the Chinese would be more interested in Western culture and the Middle Eastern cultures are not so much. Two answers to that. At one level, the Middle Eastern culture is based on a religion that rejects our lascivious lifestyle, if you will. The Chinese are not so inclined. They're titillated by everything we do. At another level, however, we don't know that the Middle Eastern young people don't have an interest in our culture. I mean, they all go to Dubai, much like the Muslims in Indonesia all go to Singapore for that weekend of food and drink. But the Chinese are not at all shy about taking a look at what we have to offer and sampling. That answers your question. It's really just totally, on the surface, just two different places entirely. Go ahead.
Yeah, a question I have, you didn't really touch on this, it's sort of as a background, I think, idea to what you're talking about. But the paradigm of a regime that is able to maintain authoritarian control, which is very traditional in China, very common in Chinese history, and also manage the expectations of the Chinese people through allowing the economy to grow. There is a new way of thinking that you can have both economic growth and authoritarian control. Can you talk about that?
That's clearly the case. You can have authoritarian, Americans tend to think that capitalism equals democracy, and they're not at all the same. You can have control over an economy that is capitalist and maintain an authoritarian regime. The problem is, the difficulty in China, where I see this not happening, and I think this is what the party wants, is that there are too many challenges to its authority that keep creeping up, keep popping up. And if there is a disaster or a collapse of their economy in any way, shape, or form, or another health scare, or massive pollution of food products by chemicals for somebody wanting to make a profit, you would see that authority challenged. I think the elements to challenge that authority are there. That's really what I'm saying in this talk. The elements are there, and that makes the system fragile. Doesn't mean it'll collapse. It doesn't mean authoritarianism isn't there. And if they institute democracy or political pluralism, it's not to say that it won't be authoritarian.
You could make the argument over the last 10 or 20 years, certainly, that all the challenges that have been faced by the regime have been managed successfully. Tibet, this earthquake last year, the problems in the Muslim area.
Well, the minority problems I'm going to leave to Professor Goldstein in his talk, but while they have managed these things to some great success, that doesn't mean the problems have gone away. And, you run into a student who was at Tiananmen, he's still bitter. He's waiting for the opportunity to do something. You have this rise of these political parties that I mentioned in the last 10, 12 years. They don't have a lot of numbers, but they do have an organization. The problems are still there. And yeah, they put it down, and yeah, China seems successful with its authoritarian, coercive elements, but it's getting weaker and weaker as it does that. And the public is getting less and less patient with that kind of thing. That's really what I'm saying. Anybody else? Kelly?
I actually have a follow-up question to the one that was just asked. So you painted the picture of the party being...
Anybody else? Kelly?
I actually have a follow-up question to the one that was just asked. So you painted the picture of the party being interested in democratizing to some extent. The first part of my question is, are they united? Are the political elite united in that opinion? The second part of my question is what is halting reform? Is it the lack of unity, or is it also that they're searching for a model? And what models are out there for consideration? You talked about how the collapse of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, or communism in those countries, was considered not the model to follow. So what are the potential models that are being considered now for political reform?
Let me deal with the first one. The models are what they're groping for, which is why you see this starting and stopping of policy implementation of different ways, shape, and form. I spent enough time in China to know that there are currency reform, which they all acknowledge as necessary, currency, isn't going to happen anytime soon because too many people will lose money. Monetary, fiscal reform, banking reform, these are all, they try this, they try that, but it is really, all of these things are too much pressure from the localities. Too many people who are in a position of owning a factory or of being owning a factory whose brother might be a vice governor or vice mayor. All of these people want to continue this flow of loans to heavy industry, and they have not been able to find the political will to put an end to that kind of thing. That's a critical question. Your first question was the first part.
Well, in general, I was more interested in the political reforms, not the economic
All right,
reforms.
right.
And to what extent is
Right.
the elite unified beyond being this idea of democracy, and what models may they be considering?
I don't think the elite is unified at all behind political reform or what it might entail, other than they seem fairly unified about opening up the party. But that maintains the party control. So, for example, there are open primaries with no endorsement at all for party posts. They let capitalists into the party. It's wide open now. In terms of political reform for the government and for society in general, I don't see a unified position at all. I see several ways they might go, and this might dictate, or the thrust or the direction China might go will be dictated by who is selected in 2012. So it's political. It's still political. Yeah.
Yeah. With regard to climate change, thank you.
Yeah.
150 million Chinese people have had to relocate due to desertification, and the Gobi Desert is progressively losing its topsoil, and it is encroaching on the city of Beijing, as you say, which would threaten their, comparable to our New York City. I think their dam, one of the major dams, produced an earthquake, and they're now down to building one coal-fired power plant, I believe, a week. So, truly, the two superpowers are continuing to move forward to this point of irreversible cataclysmic climate. And yet we constantly say, if Obama would take the leadership, perhaps China would follow. Given the impacts to China are extraordinary in terms of ability to grow crops, etc., is there a possibility that China would take the lead? Because truly, there is no one leadership, and the world is at risk, as I know it and understand it from the science. Thank you.
I think there are people in China who are willing to do that, to take the lead. There are steps that they have taken to try to reverse some of this. New Chinese automobiles, for example, have to have catalytic converters. That never was the case. But when you talk about the environment, you get into this nexus of environmental protection and economic growth. Economic growth allows the party to remain in control because it's trying to share the wealth, increase everybody's wealth as much as possible, raising living standards, etc., housing, all that. Chinese business people who I dealt with said, look, I don't want to talk about politics. We've got a relationship with the government. We stay out of politics and they stay out of our commerce. Fine and good. So with the environment, though, increasingly causing problems, and this is what I'm trying to say in this talk, the problems aren't going away. You can't brush these under the rug like you could 25, 30 years ago. They're here. There are people dying. There are people from cancer. There's 300 million people drinking contaminated water. There's, I don't know how many millions of people without water. So the Chinese solution is to take water from behind that's building up behind the new Three Gorges Dam and funneling it up through huge construction canals, if you will. They call them the South-North waterways, 3 of them, to get water to the north. Well, those won't be completed until the year 2050, 40 years from now. And while they are building those, they are exercising eminent domain over people's farms, and et cetera, et cetera. It's all, that's the tiger riding in a circle. You can't make one policy choice without affecting every other possible situation. So you address that and you ruin something there. It's like a big fish net. You pull on one knot, you're pulling them all. whether China takes the lead in this, clearly there are Chinese who understand this. And clearly they may even see the opportunity to take the lead away from the United States. But do they have the political will to do it? Because there's a risk involved. Yes?
You haven't talked about the quality of political leadership, which seems to me remarkable. Since Tiananmen, they've had terrific leaders that have opened up the society and allowed all this growth. What do you think about that?
My answer to that, my experience in China is this. Something happens that's good, and you're satisfied, but you're always waiting for that to happen. What came first, the political leadership that opened up the society, or society that forced the political leadership to allow it to be open? I don't have an answer for that. I think it's a bit of both. I think the leadership has worked for stability, has maintained stability, but it clearly is threatened by what's going on in society in general. All of these protests, some of which are violent, are over very real human issues. So I lumped, to answer your question, I didn't address political leadership as such because I lumped all these people into one category as leaders who are facing a dilemma in their society, in a changing society that is becoming more active politically, less active politically in some cases, more vocal, and more willing to protest when they have real hurts. Who the next set of leaders are, I have no idea. I don't know. Yes?
You haven't mentioned nationalism in China. It seems to me that you can make an argument that the cement that's gluing China now is nationalism, which the government advocates and
Right.
is very, very strong and much stronger than when I first went to China. And, for many people, I think, who have improved their quality of life under this system and have strong nationalism, is democracy really a good answer? Have we solved environmental problems? Have we solved poverty? Do we have health insurance? So it isn't so easy that you would say, of course, we have democracy will solve all the problems. On top of that, there's a strong feeling that China was held down and the current government is giving Chinese respect and becoming a world power. And even though there's no more communists, there are a lot of nationalists and the government is trying to represent them. So you think that that's an alternative strength?
It's clearly a strength. Nationalism is there. The government, the party, uses it in a way that they used to use Marxism-Leninism. They use nationalism. There was a TV show or a TV commercial in China the last time I was there. It was stunning to me. It said, comrades. They even used the word comrade. Don't drink these foreign beers. Drink Chinese beer. It's made of better water, better quality, better hops, whatever. That's nationalism. The number of local beers in China has diminished greatly from an onslaught of Carlsberg, Budweiser, and Pabst Blue Ribbon. I mean, it's there, and this was a nationalist plea. You can eat nationalism only so far. You can take it only so far. When you begin to hurt, if you're making a good living, and the government's leaving you alone for the first time in a long time, and you are free to travel. Chinese are traveling all over the world. Yeah, I'm Chinese. I'm a nationalist. I'm proud of my country. I'm proud that we hosted the Olympics and it came off without a hitch. But when you begin to hurt, when your family begins to die from cancer caused by poor drinking water that's caused by that factory that I can see dumping lead into the river, and nobody does anything about that factory. That's what I'm talking about. It has its limits. And all of these pressures are there. That makes the system fragile, doesn't necessarily mean a total collapse. I mean, I listed that as one of the four, but it's possible. Who knows? But yeah, nationalism is clearly, taken the place of Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought. Yes.
You talked about the demise of the Kuko system in that people who have a character, a Huko character that describes them as a person from the country, maybe as a farmer, maybe coming to the city. Hold it down. Maybe coming to the city and working there. And likewise, if you're from the city, although this is less likely, you may go to the country and work there. However, although that's true, and people are doing that all the time, the Huko system really still is there, and I wonder if you could talk more about it. And the aspect that I know of that's still there is that if you are identified as a farmer, you may have more than one child. And that's because you may need more than one child to help you with the farm work. However, if you're in the city doing a new job, you still have the same old Huko, and you can have 2 children while in the city. Now, clearly that's going to make some people jealous of each other. It can't last long. But I wonder if there's other things that the Huko system governs, and also, what do you really mean by the demise of the Huko system? It's clearly not gone.
This gets a little... I gotta hold it. The Huko system, as I understand it, gave you your residency, your job, your school for your kids, your hospital or doctor, clinic, your stores, and that's where you stayed. What has been removed is the requirement that you stay there. That if you are able to find another job, if you are able to find funding from an American university to go to school, if you are able to locate a different house, you can go for it. You're still identified as an urban resident. There is that element, urban resident, rural resident. But a rural person can go to a city and do the same thing if they have the skills or the talent or the luck or the guanxi or the connections that are required to find work. It's much less stringent than it was. Now, in terms of the children, I don't think it's stringent at all anymore. Chinese I know don't even talk about it. They have an ID card. That's all they have. They used to have a red card, they used to have a green card, they used to have a different card for this, different card for that. That's all gone. They have one ID card with a number. Of course, we do too, but it's called Social Security. In terms of the one child per family, it's much more enforced in the cities than in the countryside. But you can't say it's uniformly unenforced or enforced. It depends on the local enforcer. So if you go out to the countryside and you're having 2, 3, 4 children, and that fellow assigned to enforce the one-child policy has 4, 5, or 6 children, that's for farm labor. In the cities, it's followed pretty much. But I know people in the cities who've had 2, 3, 4, 5 kids. I ran into a guy from Guangzhou on the train. He had 4 kids crawling all over him, and he was laughing like crazy. I said, "Whose kids are these?" He said, "They're mine." I said, "How'd you do that?" He said, "I paid the fine." How high is the fine? You have 1, that's fine. You have 2, you might have to pay a fine. You have 3, another fine. But how high is the fine? Is it comparable to your income? All of those questions go into what exactly does this policy, how is this policy implemented? And I dare say that it's Chinese economy, Chinese politics, Chinese implementation of policy is highly, highly fragmented. There is no uniformity much anywhere, except the government might react to Tibetans who are rioting. They'll send in the army and all that stuff. But I don't see a unified implementation of government policy. I hope that answers your question. Maybe not. I just, we used to have this thing in China that says, if you go to China for 2 weeks, you can come home and write a book. If you can go to China and stay there 6 weeks, you can come home and write an article. If you stay any longer, you don't know what to say. So this is the reality that I see when I'm dealing with China. Anything else? Well, thank you all for coming.